Irenaeus became Bishop of Lyon following a persecution of the Christians there under the orders of Marcus Aurelius, which left the previous bishop brutalized and ultimately dying of his injuries at an old age. Irenaeus had been a student of Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, who himself had died a martyr's death at a very old age. And Polycarp had been a student of the Apostle John, who also died at an old age. When the Easter controversy broke out, a bunch of the church was celebrating Easter on a different day from the rest of the church, and both sides claimed that their traditions had been passed down from the apostles through the generations to that day. One side was saying that their tradition had come from Peter and Paul, the other side from John and Philip. Irenaeus wanted there to be an allowance for diversity on this issue. I mean, it wasn't a doctrinal issue. It wasn't about the meaning of Easter or whether or not Christ rose from the dead bodily, just about what day to celebrate it on. On the flip side, Irenaeus was very forceful against the Gnostic heretical groups of the Marcians and the Valentinians. He actually wrote a work that survives to this day called Against Heresies. Now, I will say he was very fair in his dealings with their doctrine or false doctrine. He spends a good part of the first part of the book barely interjecting as he lays out their beliefs. And recent discoveries, fairly recent discoveries in Egypt, show he actually was very well acquainted with their beliefs and had relied on their works as he was laying out what they believed. Now, he does go on to contrast their beliefs with what had been the Christian teaching always, everywhere, and by all, and, showing that these heretical groups were not Christian and that Christians should reject their teaching. Ultimately, it was the heretical groups that had self-segregated or self-separated from the Christians, the true Christians, and had kind of formed their own little groups. Valentinians were very good about using Christian terms and language to mean unchristian ideas. And I think that's something important to point out because we see a lot of that going on today where Christianity is being co-opted for various purposes, and the language of Christianity is being used to express unchristian ideas. This is something that goes back to the 2nd century with Irenaeus, and it's something we should be mindful of today as we hear things that sound familiar. We hear things that sound like Christianity, but we need to be on guard, as Irenaeus was, to see what ideas are truly being conveyed. So on the one hand, Irenaeus is calling for Irenaeusism, or peaceful diversity and toleration, when issues arose which didn't involve teaching. It didn't involve the core of the Christian faith. Just what day do we celebrate Easter on? It's okay. We can have diversity. On the other hand, when the Marcians were wanting to throw out most of Scripture and claim that the God of the Old Testament was not the same God revealed in Jesus, obviously that is not Christian. It was not what was taught clearly in Scripture and then always everywhere by all throughout Christian history. And so Irenaeus had to stand against that. And I think that's a beautiful example for us today where we need to live in that tension. We need to live between, on the one hand, having toleration for differences, and on the other hand, standing very firmly against heresy. Of course, not all issues are as consequential as the core tenets of Christianity, and not all issues are as inconsequential as what day to celebrate Easter on. There's a whole bunch of different levels of importance in between those two extremes, and I think as Christians in today's world, particularly in the West, we have to navigate those issues. I mean, you have issues that are of great theological importance, where each side recognizes that the other side are Christians, but the differences are so big that it may be impractical for them to worship together every Sunday. I'm thinking of, Presbyterians and Reformed Baptists, a lot of theological overlap. But if you're a young adult parent and you have small children, you may want them baptized. Well, that may decide for you what church to be a member of. Likewise, you may have charismatics and cessationists. Well, big enough difference, it probably is going to mean that you don't worship together on every Sunday. And then some matters are practical differences. They become practically big concerns, but they're not theologically big concerns. I'm thinking of kind of high church expressions where you have liturgy and vestments, and low church expressions where you might have fog machines and dim lights and a praise band. Now, I think those differences are often born out of theology, but they themselves, the practices themselves, are not theological per se. All those things could practically divide people on Sunday morning, but would not divide us in our beliefs, core beliefs, or our affirmation that those who do things differently than us or believe differently than us on those issues are in fact Christians. So I think on the host of issues between those two extremes of celebrating Easter and the core tenets of the faith, we do need to ask ourselves a few questions. One, what has been taught clearly in Scripture? If you're considering beliefs, you need to say, okay, was this clearly laid out in Scripture? And how important of a doctrine is it? And then we also have to ask ourselves, what has been the Christian stance throughout history? There are today in the West affirmations of lifestyles in certain areas of the church which have been condemned clearly in Scripture and have been condemned by the church always, everywhere, by all. We don't get to rewrite Christian teaching 2,000 years into the faith. You can choose to be a Christian or not, but you can't pick and choose what to believe regarding what the church has taught always, everywhere, and by all. And then I would also ask myself, is this an issue of practical concern where it would so shape the rest of what's being taught in the church or the rest of the practices of the church that it just wouldn't make it a good fit? You have issues like, let's say, predestination and free will. That may be something of such practical concern. You may choose to go to a church that has one belief or the other, just because it kind of shapes everything else that's being taught. So as you're navigating the issues, I think you also need to ask yourself about, the health of your soul, and how are the issues going to shape me and aid my growth in holiness? I think those are important questions to ask, particularly if you have children. You need to be very concerned about the health of your children's souls. If you're navigating through, what doctrines and practices are big enough issues that they'll shape where you go to church or what churches and other Christians you are in communion with, there is a book I would love to recommend. It is by Dr. Gavin Ortlund. It's called Finding the Right Hills to Die On, The Case for Theological Triage. And this is a book that's endorsed by people kind of throughout the spectrum of Christians. But it's a really good book. It's very approachable. It's written for a popular audience. I think anybody interested in the topic of theological triage, ranking the importance of issues and deciding what things to divide over and what things not to, anybody interested in that topic would find this book easy to read, to understand, and would be well taught by it. Also, Gavin Ortlund has a great YouTube channel called Truth Unites. He happens to be a continuationist, kind of Reformed Baptist. Certainly not exactly the theological corner that I'm in, but guess what? I really have been taught and edified by him and his work, and I would encourage other people to seek out his work. My goodness, that kind of goes with the topic of the video, doesn't it? Another book, if you want to learn a little more about Irenaeus, this book by John Baer is probably the greatest single volume work that I've encountered on Irenaeus. It goes through, it touches on Polycarp and the Martians and the Valentinians. It refutes some of the older liberal scholarship on Irenaeus, and really is just an exceptional work. I would highly recommend it. Now, it is kind of an academic work, so I don't know, it's not quite as approachable as Dr. Ortland's book. Obviously, they're different topics, but I'm just saying this here would be for somebody who maybe has a high interest in theology and maybe church history. Maybe not as approachable, though. So I'd love to hear what you have to say, and yeah, God bless. This is Theology in Action.